Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. Larry Pratt.
Well, good morning. Piers Morgan sends his regrets he won't be able to attend. He is sort of the epitome of the ruling class, right down to the accent. It's everything we don't like about people like that. And so I've kind of, he's growing on me. I appreciate the role that he plays in our motivational process. You know, the ruling class is truly something to behold. They know everything. Take Joe Biden. Really, take him. You can have him. Shotgun Joe, as I like to call him. He is so full of useful advice. Just shoot it out the back door. Well, then shoot it through the door. I know for a fact that the Secret Service cringes whenever he's on the loose. He's really an amazing sort of guy. Even though it was a Brit, or maybe because it was a Brit, it was such a quintessential experience dealing with the ruling class. I was on a CNN International program on the eve of the British enacting their current almost total gun ban in the United Kingdom. And I was opposite a member of Parliament, a conservative, a Tory. Boy, does that mean something different there than it does here. And he was so happy that his party was on the eve of introducing and actually enacting this almost total gun ban. And I told him that if they went ahead and did that, I'm not a prophet, but just based on our own experience in the United States and from the work that Dr. John Lott had done, published in his book, More Guns, Less Crime. That's the easiest thing to understand, by the way, about the book, the title. The inners are really, they can be quite complicated with all kinds of regression analyses demonstrating his thesis, More Guns, Less Crime. And so anyway, this parliamentarian was kind of taken aback by that. And he said, well, I say anybody that would say something like that over here, we'd say he's quite flaky. And I said, yeah, I know you would. That's why we're no longer British. So, of course, unhappily, I was right. Now, their murder rate does truly remain lower than ours. However, the trade-off is it's the fourth most violent country in the world, only surpassed by El Salvador, Honduras, and Jamaica. So it's not been a very happy experience, but like most things that socialists do, they don't learn. And they just keep repeating their same errors. And so I don't see any likelihood that they're going to repent of their foolishness anytime soon. We got a few good things that are on the table here in Washington. It won't take long to describe them because they're not that many. But one of them is a bill that's been put forth in the past by Senator Thune of South Dakota, which has the surprisingly simple and sensible notion that if you have a concealed carry permit, say here in Virginia, then just like your driver's license, you ought to be able to use it anywhere else you go in the country, and at least anywhere else where they have a concealed carry permit system. There's currently one exception, Illinois, as in the People's Republic of, but under court order, they are within probably less than 90 days of having to enact some kind of permit system. And I'm kind of hoping that their legislature fools around long enough that they don't meet the deadline, because then they would have a constitutional carry system, meaning they would be joining the other 4 states that currently are constitutional carry states. You don't need a permit in New Hampshire, Wyoming, Alaska, and Arizona to carry a concealed firearm. And I can almost guarantee you, kind of the way I did with that British parliamentarian, something opposite of what I was telling him would happen in Chicago. Once the criminal element realizes that folks like us can be packing a heat under our coat, in our purse, or wherever, crime is going to plummet in Chicago. And no thanks to the current authorities, but because right now their highly restrictive system of gun laws and regulations has led to Chicago being just about the most dangerous place in the country. In fact, one of the most dangerous places in the world. I think Ciudad Juarez still takes that honor, but Chicago's in competition. And by the way, Ciudad Juarez is an interesting case because right across the river in Texas is the city of El Paso. El Paso is a place, because it's in Texas, where you can carry a concealed firearm. From the highest murder rate in the world to one of the lower murder rates in the world, especially for a large city, is El Paso. Those are just numbers. The question of the United Nations Treaty on Arms, small arms, comes up, so I thought maybe I should address it. Happily, it's not going anywhere. But it's the most amazing thing. I've learned that even though it's been apparent to me, years, that this treaty is DOA, if it ever were to be signed, which it was this week, it's not going to go anywhere. The United States Senate probably will never get a chance to hear it. I'm not sure Harry Reid would like to force his Democrats to vote on this because the UN is loathed by the American public, and I share that view. It is a thugocracy. It deserves to be loathed. It has presided over genocide, and genocide is only possible when the victims are disarmed, as in Rwanda, which had a disarmament just prior to the genocide being carried out, while the UN troops, and in some cases facilitated, when Rwandans would come to the Blue Helmets seeking refuge, the refuge turned them back, where they were then summarily killed. That's the UN I love. The Second Amendment has as a purpose, an exclusive purpose, the disabling of the very kind of thing I was just describing. The Second Amendment is not for hunting. It's not even for self-defense. It's for, well, I was going to put it a little more strongly than maybe I should. It's for restraining tyrannical tendencies in government. Let's put it that way. If need be, by active measures. And one of our members one time was lobbying with a very liberal member of Congress from New York. But then I guess I repeat myself, a member of Congress from New York is sufficient to describe. And in the middle of his presentation about what he was concerned about, this member of Congress interjected, "You want to shoot me, don't you?" And actually, it hadn't entered his mind until that time. But, you know, it's kind of a good thing that it's in their minds, especially those of the liberal, tyrannical end of the spectrum. There is some restraint, and even if the voters of Brooklyn don't hold them back, it may be that there are other ways that their impulses are somewhat restrained. That's the whole idea of the Second Amendment. It's most successful when nothing goes click. How did you put that? Click kapow? Click pow? Yeah, I like that. Excellent. I learned something early this morning. That's good. It's going to be a good day. Look at how the liberal thinks. Well, not too carefully, because it's just so early in the morning indeed. But we know from years of experience dealing with them that the idea of self-defense is really odious to the liberal, to the anti-self-defense mentality. Self-defense is provocative. It only makes the situation more volatile and more likely to escalate from just talking to violence. And that's the train of thinking that they're on. Well, isn't it interesting that they were having the same thoughts, expressing the same views about Benghazi? And wasn't it the most anti-self-defense administration, in my memory anyway, that withdrew forces from Benghazi 2-3 weeks before everything fell apart and people were killed because there was nobody to defend them? What an incredible mindset. Those who hate God love death. And they just seem to be riveted to the idea that it's really cool to be unable to defend oneself. Somehow that will magically make things sweeter and nicer. On the other hand, they're willing to do things like Fast and Furious, actually intentionally arming the Mexican cartels. Wow. But it had a good political purpose. It was to instruct us that we need more gun control. Actually, the lesson we should take away from Fast and Furious is we need better government control. That's And all the while, the Republicans have hardly said boo about all of the blood that was shed by Fast and Furious. That's really, in my mind, as scandalous as the murders themselves is the silence that has greeted all of this slaughter. John Boehner should have been all over this like white on rice. But then John Boehner, it turns out, has been recently classified as a new phylum by zoologists. He walks upright without a vertebra. And so, naturally, the poor guy isn't going to be able to do anything about a situation as volatile as Fast and Furious. And they let the government proceed as if they weren't even there in the Congress. Representative Hulskamp, just a week or two ago, asked Big Sis, a.k.a. Janet Napolitano, so how many bullets have you been buying lately? There are all kinds of numbers been out there, easily 100 million for the year for their 100,000 armed agents. And she gives no answer. She just blows off a member of Congress. And apparently that's just going to be the end of it. We truly have an imperial presidency. I guess the issue of the day, happily it's going to die, is the so-called instant background check. The instant background check would be better known as the Instant Gun Owner Registry, because that's what it accomplishes. The idea of fighting crime with a background check is just silly, because it's, well, I think it might have resulted in some 30 prosecutions and even fewer convictions last year out of hundreds of thousands and millions of checks. So it is not a crime-fighting tool. It is a way of building a registry of gun owners in this country. And I have on my desk a letter from the Department of Justice to those who, for the first time as dealers, use an electronic portal through the internet to do a background check on a client. And this letter that they can print out, and one of them gave it to us, says that the names and addresses that they submit, they have to understand and agree, by participating in this way, become the property of the United States government to do as they wish. Well, that's just in violation of 2 federal laws, so I guess that's no really big deal. They are simply out of control. They don't care what the law is. They're specifically forbidden from doing what I was just describing, and they're doing it anyway. And what does the Congress do about it? Zippo. So no wonder they increasingly act as if they are an emperor, because there's no effective restraint on them. The Congress, just to remind us all, does have the power of the purse. We could shut them down tomorrow. No volunteers across the river. No pay, no bureaucrats. And yet we don't do that. It's really outrageous. It is. This makes them complicit in the crimes of this administration because they have the power to restrict and they don't. So I think we need to probably look for our recourses elsewhere, although I do want to mention that Representative Steve Stockman, the first hour of the new Congress showed why we had so heavily invested in trying to get him back into the Congress after a hiatus of over a decade. He introduced a measure that said that the gun-free school zones is hereby repealed, so that now if his measure were to become law, teachers, principals, anybody with a concealed carry permit would be able to defend themselves and the children in these murder magnets that have been created by gun-free school zones, or more generally, gun-free zones. We're very pleased that he's been as proactive as we were expecting that he would be, because that's who he is. But the real hope, I think, that we have for checking tyranny in our country is at the state and local level. There are probably a couple dozen and more states that have measures before them or have had this year that would either say at a minimum their own law enforcement personnel would not participate with a gun grab by the federal government. And in some cases, the measures provide for arresting federal officials, which I think is kind of a good sort of bill. That kind of says who's the boss. And in a state, the feds are not the boss. They have very few, you can look at them in Article 1, Section 8, specific areas where we've given them authority to act. And outside of that, they don't have any authority. And yet they think that if the federal government has a law, has a regulation, that somehow we all have to snap and salute and say, what is it you want me to do, mein Führer? Well, that's not exactly the way the Constitution was set up. And increasingly, the states are pushing back. And in the area of the Second Amendment, we're seeing that very nicely. But even perhaps more active, a pushback is occurring at the county level. I've met with a sheriff in Otero County, New Mexico, who was approached by members, citizens in his county, which straddles the Rocky Mountains, and after a certain elevation, it's heavily forested. And they wanted to make sure in one of the villages on top of the Rockies there that they cut a fire break around the national forest that surrounded their village, because if a forest fire occurred, which it did last summer, that they would have that fire break to protect the lives and property of the people in the village. The Forest Service, of course, didn't want that to happen. Trees are more important than people, and fires are natural, people are not, and so they resisted. Well, the county fathers passed an ordinance saying that an 80,000 acre fire break could be cut around Cloudcroft, New Mexico, and it subsequently was. And the Forest Service really didn't have anything they could do about it. They do have a police force at the Forest Service. Initially, I thought it was because maybe somebody would try to hug a tree too hard and they might arrest them. But instead, it's for this horribly lawless behavior of trying to protect a village by cutting down some trees, dead trees at that, because they're the first to torch, of course. Also interesting was a sheriff in Elkhart County, Indiana, who's now become one of our members, I'm happy to say. Sheriff Brad Rogers was approached by a farmer who produces raw milk. For whatever reason, I'm not entirely sure, the FDA thinks that raw milk is a contaminated product. I guess it hasn't been cooked enough for their satisfaction, hasn't been cooked at all, and therefore qualifies as something to be on the ban list. And they really are obsessive about it. In fact, in a county not far from there in Wisconsin, a farmer had his whole dairy equipment confiscated by the state equivalent of the FDA. So the farmer went to Brad Rogers and said, look, they've been inspecting me like crazy. They're on the verge of confiscating my equipment. Can you help me? And the sheriff went out just to make sure he wasn't going to be, as it were, buying a pig in a poke. And in fact, the farm was spotless, as it would have to be if it's going to be a raw milk producer. And then he went back to his office and emailed the lead attorney at the FDA and said, if you put a foot on Farmer Hostetler's farm, I'll arrest you. And back came a response, well, if you try that, we'll arrest you. And so he had one final communication with them, game on. And you know what? That was 15 months ago. And that milk is still being produced. But what a difference, because the poor farmer up in Wisconsin lost his equipment that was stolen by the state authorities. He's out of business. His company is destroyed. He was wiped out. So it makes a huge difference who we get elected as sheriff. I can't think of an office more important than that of the local sheriff. And if we have one that understands Article 1, Section 8 and has the backbone to enforce it, then we have somebody that's a real treasure. And we have some 380, which is a little over 10% of the sheriffs of the country who have made statements, and some of them, like this Brad Rogers, taken action to show that they understand the limits of federal authority, which are actually quite extensive limits. The federal government was not intended to be this behemoth across the river and, in fact, across the land. It has grown entirely beyond what it was initially intended, and the sheriffs are really our best bet for controlling them, since people like the Speaker of the House don't seem to have the wherewithal internally to deal with the problem. Sheriffs are doing it. And since they are the top cop, they're the only elected cop in the country, they supersede in authority the FBI, the BLM, the state police, anybody else. They're the man or woman. And so that sheriff's office is probably our best bet to reclaim our liberties and put the federal genie back in the bottle. We do have one other instrument in our fight against tyranny, and that's the jury. And if we ever get called to be on a jury, please do everything you can to get on the jury. I was in a jury pool once, not too long ago, and I was really hoping, apparently it was a criminal case, that I would be impaneled, but the guy or gal, don't know who it was, don't know what the charge was, pled out. And I was thinking, man, I sure hope you're guilty, because if you were innocent and you pled, you missed it, because I was probably going to be on that jury. And there's no way I'm going to convict. Now, I'll convict to hang him if that's what's appropriate. But if I have the slightest whiff of misdeed, misprocess by the authorities, I'm voting to acquit. And I can hang that jury by my one vote. So we have tremendous power to push back, and we don't even need to have a gun with us when we enter that jury box. It's perhaps more powerful than my cartridge box. So look forward, if you can, to getting on one of those juries. Don't run away from it. Don't be too busy. When we lobby the Congress, I guess there's two different approaches. One is to go cut a deal, and the other is to tell them to get out of our life. And we think that certainly when dealing with the Second Amendment, I can't speak to people that are looking to get their snout in the trough, but when we're trying to defend our liberty, there's really only one message: get out. Leave us alone, and we'll leave you alone. And if you don't leave us alone, game on. That's, I think, ultimately the message that we have to deliver to our elected officials. And how I rejoiced when I saw Rand Paul and his band of merry men stand up to the leadership who were clucking all the while about how inappropriate it was to conduct a filibuster of the sort that he did, and to carry it off. And he accomplished at least one of the objectives that he set out to accomplish, got some information that the regime did not want to provide. But I think that shows that there still is a little bit of fight left, even in the Senate, and the thought that there are members of the Senate that will be so disruptive of the behavior expected of a member of the club is really very refreshing. We've waited a long time for men of this mettle to come into town, and what Rand Paul and Ted Cruz and some of the others did was such a welcome development. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we have perhaps turned a corner. We're at least calling them out, and we're challenging them. And if this sets the tone for the 14 elections, then I think we can be even a little bit more optimistic. Not that we don't just sit back and let it happen by itself. Obviously, no. But it means that if we do put our shoulder to the wheel, we might well expect to see returns like we've not seen in many a year. And so I would challenge all of us to look forward to 2014 as a time when we get involved as never before, look for those candidates that deserve our support, the Rand Pauls, the Ted Cruzes, and the many others, the Steve Stockmans in the House, and try to multiply their number. So with that cautious optimism, I'll end and turn the program back to you, sir. Yeah?